War, Vietnam War, Vietnam, CBS, Vietnam, the Vietnam War,
Vietnam, CBS News,
The war, news, the Vietnam War, the Vietnam War, news, the Vietnam War, news, Vietnam, the Vietnam War, news, the Vietnam War, CBS News, news,
Vietnam,
news, Vietnam, the war in Vietnam, the war in Vietnam, the war.
Vietnam, New York,
Vietnam, CBS News, CBS News, CBS News, CBS News, War,
the United States,
Vietnam, the New York, Vietnam, the war, the New York,
Vietnam, the War of Vietnam, CBS News, Vietnam, Vietnam,
War,
Vietnam, the war in Vietnam, the War, Vietnam War,
news, Vietnam, war,
Vietnam, CBS, the war, CBS in Vietnam, the war, Vietnam,
CBS News, War, Vietnam War, news, Vietnam War,
the Vietnam War, Vietnam, the news, United States, the war, Vietnam, news, the war in Vietnam, the news, the war,
Vietnam, war, New York,
the United States, the war, United States, the war,
in New York, the war,
Vietnam, CBS News, war, news, Vietnam, the war, United States,
Vietnam,
War, the war, Vietnam,
news, the war,
Vietnam, the United States, Vietnam War,
the United States, news,
Vietnam.